The Reverend Dr. Lewis Weil died on March 9th at the age of 86. Some of you may have read his books on liturgy, the fancy word for worship. Liturgy for Living is the best known one. Lewis was a towering figure in the Episcopal Church in the second half of the 20th century. He was one of the principal architects of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, the text that revolutionized worship in the Episcopal Church and placed baptism and Eucharist at the center of our common life. Lewis's quiet mentorship of gay seminarians helped many of them claim a place in the church, especially in the 1980s and 90s when being out often meant not being ordained or not finding a job. Lewis knew this dilemma well as a gay man himself. But Lewis will be most remembered for his 60-year vocation as a professor of liturgy, first at an Episcopal seminary in Puerto Rico, then at Nashotah House in Wisconsin, and finally at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, California, where I got to study with him at the end of his career. Lewis taught thousands of students how to lead worship and why we worship as we do. And not only worship, but about being an ordained person. I hope each of you had a teacher like Lewis in your life, someone who taught you a subject with great skill and enthusiasm and laughter, and also shaped you into the person you became. I am not sure that I will ever understand the depth of Lewis's influence on my priesthood. There are so many things he taught me that have become part of me, and I don't remember that I learned them from him. When my close friend Wiley Ammons preached at our Renewal of Ministry service last fall, he told you, Gia knows how to keep the main thing the main thing. Until I read tributes to Lewis Weil after he died, I had forgotten how he used to exhort his students to keep the main thing the main thing. Wiley went to a different seminary than I did. He never knew Lewis, didn't know he used to say that. That Wiley picked out Lewis's exact words might be the highest praise I have ever received. One thing I do remember Lewis saying often, harping on if I'm being honest, was the need to adapt and change our practice over time. He'd sometimes encounter priests who told him, I do everything in the Eucharist exactly the way I learned it 35 years ago. And Lewis's response was always, then you're not doing it properly. Good liturgy depends on context, on the practices of this particular gathering of people, worshiping in this particular space, encountering God in this particular time and culture. And if you do it exactly the same way every time, you are not paying attention to your context. You are not paying attention to how God is present and active in and with and to and for the people in front of you. The prophet Isaiah, the second prophet of that name, spoke to the people of Judah at the lowest point in their history. Once Judah was part of Israel, a strong nation united under the great King David. But David's been gone for 400 years. His kingdom split into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And the divided kingdoms were easy pickings for powerful neighbors. Israel was the first to fall. It was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. Judah resisted the Assyrians, but then the Assyrians were conquered by an even more powerful empire, Babylon. And Judah couldn't hold out against Babylon. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians put Jerusalem under siege. And when they finally took the city, they destroyed the temple, blinded the king, killed the rest of the royal family, seized the land, and forced the people of Judah into exile in Babylon. Everything that gave Judah its identity was gone. The people, the line of kings descended from David, the temple, the only place they could worship God, the land itself. The exiles were devastated. Psalm 137 recounts how they sat down by the waters of Babylon and wept when they remembered Jerusalem. The songs that reminded them of home were so painful, they hung up their harps and gave up music altogether. The exiles had no hope. They were marinating in despair. They could not see how anyone, even God, could possibly help them. Often, when we're trying to find God's presence and activity in our lives, we look to our past, how God has been present and active for us before. I certainly do this myself, and when someone comes to me for guidance, I will ask, how have you known what God wanted you to do in previous times when you've had to make tough decisions? When you've gone through a spiritually dry season before, where was God for you then? The exiles of Judah know how God has acted in the lives of their people in the past. They remember the story every year at Passover, how long before King David, the people of Israel had been enslaved in Egypt, held captive, forced to labor and to endure harsh treatment. With God's help, Moses persuaded Pharaoh to let God's people go. The people of Israel packed up their things and began their journey to the land God had promised them. But just as they arrived at the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army caught them. Israel was trapped between the water and the army. It looked like this was it. But God acted to save them. God made a way through the water for Israel until all were safely across to the other side. And when the Egyptian army tried to follow, God sent the sea crashing over Pharaoh's chariots and charioteers. Hundreds of years later, the exiles of Judah know this story. But God can't save them this way now. Babylon is a desert. There's no sea here. The dangers they face are thirst and wild animals, not an army chasing them. The exiles worry that God can't help them this time. The prophet Isaiah acknowledges this history. Yes, God makes a way in the sea. God brings out chariot and horse and extinguishes them like the wick of a candle. But then Isaiah says something surprising. Do not remember the things of old. Do not look back on the way God saved Israel in the past. For Isaiah says, God is about to do a new thing. God's new thing is even now springing forth. Can you see it? Can you notice the new thing God is doing? God made a way in the sea back then. God makes a way in the desert now. Wild animals will honor God. Instead of attacking the people of God, the jackals and ostriches will join God's people in praise and worship. God gives water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, for God's people to drink as they travel. God is creating a new Garden of Eden, a place of peace and abundance where all God's creatures, humans and animals, can live in harmony. This is not like the Exodus from Egypt, Isaiah knows. It's so new that the exiles might not perceive what God is doing now. If the people of Judah get too hung up on what God did back then, if they fixate on the parting of the sea and how it can't happen this time, they won't notice the rivers in the desert and the wild animals honoring the Creator. They'll miss the new thing God is doing. The new thing does not undo the old. God absolutely did save the people of Israel from slavery all those years ago. The people are right to remember and cherish that act of salvation. But God is not constrained by what God did in the past. God can do a new thing now. God is doing a new thing now because God's people are different this time. Their needs are different this time. The exiles need water in the desert now, and that's what God will provide for them. So pay attention, Isaiah says. Keep your eyes open for God's presence and activity among us now. You'll notice God surprising you, saving you in a way you didn't know you needed until God made it happen. And it did happen for the exiles. The political situation in Babylon changed, and after 45 years, the exiles were allowed to go home to Judah. It was a daunting journey, walking 1,000 miles on foot with only the food and water they could carry. But the exiles were saved by the new thing God did. God did make a path in the wilderness and rivers in the desert for them. They got home to Judah in safety and began to rebuild their lives. And they had another story to tell of God's care and provision and salvation, a story they would never have known if all they could see was the past. I think this is why my teacher, Lewis Weil, harped on the importance of context and the need to change. Because God is constantly doing a new thing. God doesn't do things in only one way. God can and does do new things all the time. We are different than we were even a few years ago. Our needs are different. So God changes God's actions to save us as we need to be saved right now. We hang up our harps in despair, we take them down again, and we find that our song is a little bit different now. Maybe there's a new verse or a chord that wasn't there before. Perhaps we need to write a new song that carries echoes of the old even as the melody changes. God's new thing calls forth a new response in us. Isaiah offers the exiles and us a profound hope. And as Lewis Weil insisted, to have that hope, we have to notice how God is present and active in and with and to and for us. Not only people 2,000 years ago or even 5 years ago, but for us today. As we move towards Holy Week and our celebration of Easter, we pay attention to God among us. Because God is about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?